Alright folks, welcome back to Radio 28. So, Trump's back in the White House as of January 20th, 2025, talk about a comeback after that election fiasco in 2020. And boy, has he shaken things up since taking office. First off, he brought in Elon Musk to help revamp the whole White House operation. He's going after the deep state, those entrenched bureaucrats who've been running the show for way too long. Plus, he's building his own media empire to rival the outlets that he claims screwed him over in the 2020 election. But it's pretty clear what's happening here. Trump is creating an absolute authoritarian regime. When it comes to countries outside of the US, it's pretty obvious from his campaign slogans, MAG, what he's all about. He wants to cement America's position as the top dog in the world and won't tolerate anyone who disagrees with him. Take what happened on December 10, 2025, for example. The Canadian Prime Minister, Trudeau, was at a dinner with Trump, trying to negotiate some trade deals. But Trump wouldn't budge an inch and even jokingly suggested that Canada should just become the 51st state. Ever since then, Trump has brought up the idea of Canada joining the US as the 51st state in public speeches and appearances, and he doesn't seem to be joking anymore.
I'd like to see Canada become our 51st state.
Could this actually happen? Or is he just messing around? Personally, I think it's totally possible. Why do I think it's possible? Well, remember when Trump mentioned William McKinley a bunch of times in his inaugural speech? And how his policies seem to be mirroring McKinley's from back in the day, even if Trump isn't a huge fan of McKinley. Personally, he's definitely a believer in his approach to running the country. Let's take a quick look at America's 25th president, William McKinley. William McKinley was the 25th President of the United States, serving from 1897 to 1901. He was a major political figure in American history, leading the Republican Party during the late Gilded Age, and get this, McKinley's face is on the $500 bill. Back in the late 1800s, American industry was booming, but they were also facing some stiff competition from Europe. Lots of folks were pushing for higher tariffs to protect American businesses, basically, taxes on imported goods to make them more expensive. McKinley was a big believer in this idea. He thought high tariffs would boost the US economy and create more jobs. McKinley's most famous move on trade was the McKinley Tariff Act back in 1890. This thing jacked up import taxes big time, hitting an average rate of 50%. The whole point was to give American manufacturers a leg up and make them more competitive at home. Besides the McKinley Tariff Act, President McKinley also pushed through some other tariff stuff, like the Dingley Tariff Act of 1897. This one really cranked up those import taxes, taking the average rate to an all-time high. President McKinley's tariff policies had a mixed bag of effects on the US economy. On the one hand, those high tariffs definitely gave some protection to American industries and helped them grow. But on the other hand, they also led to higher prices, which hurt consumers. Basically, President McKinley's tariff moves were a major turning point in US history. His policies gave the economy a short-term boost, but they also came with some downsides. Trump is clearly taking a page from McKinley's book when it comes to tariffs. And now, the way he's acting towards Canada, the Panama Canal, and Greenland, well, it wouldn't be surprising if he follows McKinley's lead there too. McKinley was a firm believer in expanding America's reach. He thought the US needed to grab more land overseas to get more resources, markets, and strategic advantages. His expansionist ideas were pretty popular back then, with many Americans thinking the US should be a bigger player on the world stage. President McKinley's in the Spanish-American War land grab turned the US into a massive empire, stretching all the way from the Pacific to the Caribbean. This really set the stage for America's rise to power in the 20th century. You're right to pick up on that. McKinley's biggest land grab definitely set the stage for America becoming a major global power in the 20th century. Think about it, those territories gave the US a foothold in both the Pacific and the Caribbean, which was huge for trade, military strategy, and projecting American influence. It's hard to overstate how significant that expansion was for what America eventually became. The Spanish-American War kicked off in 1898, all because of Cuba's fight for independence and that whole USS Maine explosion in Havana Harbor. The US came out on top, taking control or outright grabbing Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Guam from Spain. They even shelled out $20 million to Spain for the Philippines, but the Filipinos weren't having it and fought back in what became the Philippine-American War. Besides that whole Spanish-American War thing, McKinley was busy expanding U.S. territory in other ways too. Like in 1898, when the U.S. officially annexed Hawaii, making it part of the U.S. And then there's that whole Samoa thing. In 1899, the US teamed up with Germany and the UK to carve up the Samoan Islands in the Samoa Treaty. On September 14, 1901, McKinley was assassinated by an anarchist in Buffalo, New York. His death shocked the entire nation and marked the end of an important era in American history. McKinley was also the first president to be assassinated while in office. The one thing I don't think Trump will copy from McKinley is his attitude toward war. Trump seems to really dislike getting into military conflicts. Think about the Afghanistan withdrawal and how he's trying to broker peace in the Gaza and Ukraine situations. He's definitely trying to find his own way to handle these things without jumping straight into war. Trump's definitely using his economic muscle to try and bully Canada into becoming the 51st state. He announced a 25% tariff hike on Canadian imports back on January 30, 2025, then said he'd hold off for 30 days. And now, White House officials are saying Trump's planning to slap another 25% tariff on steel and aluminum coming from Canada. So, we're talking about a possible 50% tariff on steel and aluminum, way harsher than what he's doing to other countries. Under the impact of the tariff war, Canada's steel and aluminum, automobile, agriculture, and energy industries will be greatly impacted. This is because Canada is really more dependent on trade with the United States to some extent. The United States, because of its much larger economic size than Canada, will be relatively less affected. If the two countries cause millions of people to lose their jobs due to the tariff war, the negative impact on Canada will be several times that of the United States, according to Canada's population clock and Worldometer's population survey. Canada currently has a population of approximately 41 million, while the United States has 335 million, so we know that the economic scale is completely incomparable. When it comes to land area, Canada and the US are both pretty big, but there's a slight difference. Canada is huge, covering roughly 9.98 million square kilometers, making it the second largest country in the world. And the US? It's pretty big too, covering roughly 9.8 million square kilometers, ranking fourth globally. So, Canada is a bit bigger than the US in terms of land. What's interesting is that Canada's population is only about 1/8 of the US, but it has more land. Canada is loaded with natural resources. It has tons of oil and natural gas, and it's the world's third largest mining country, producing over 60 different metals and minerals. It's a major player in the global production of many metals, like gold, uranium, and nickel. Canada also has abundant potash, coal, iron, zinc, copper, aluminum, asbestos, and diamonds. The US and Canada have been super close since after the war, like, they're practically inseparable. I mean, they share a language and have this massive border, like 8,891 kilometers. That's totally unguarded. Plus, they've got a lot of the same geographical features, like the Rockies, the Great Lakes, and the Atlantic coast. The US has always had its eye on Canada, and they've actually tried to take it by force twice in history. The first time was way back during the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783. The US was just starting out and thought it would be a good idea to bring Canada into the fold. That whole thing was called the Canadian Campaign, and it was a part of the Revolution. Back then, both Canada and the US were under British rule. The American revolutionaries figured that if they could grab Canada, they'd weaken Britain's hold on North America and expand their own territory. Plus, some Americans were hoping to get Canadians on their side in the fight against the British. So, in 1775, the Continental Army went ahead and invaded Canada. They split their forces into two groups, one heading for Montreal and the other aiming for Quebec City. But things didn't go as planned. They were low on supplies, the weather was brutal, and the British put up a good fight. On December 31, 1775, the American troops launched an attack on Quebec City, but it was a total disaster. Their commander, Richard Montgomery, was killed in the battle, and a bunch of his soldiers were captured. That pretty much marked the end of the US's plan to take over Canada. Right after that, we had the War of 1812, which was a fight between the US and Great Britain, who was also representing Canada at the time. That whole mess lasted from 1812 to 1815. There were a bunch of reasons it started, like trade disputes, some issues with Native American tribes, and the US just really wanting to expand north. They had their eyes on Canada for a while, but the US didn't actually manage to take over Canada in that war. Instead, Canada, with Britain's help, fought off the American invasion. According to the BBC, an Ipsos poll conducted in January found that 80% of Canadians oppose becoming part of the US. This proves that the vast majority of Canadians have a strong sense of their own national identity. But will people bow to reality? Early on in the Russia-Ukraine war, Ukraine's president did a great job of getting a ton of financial and military support from other countries. But now, after 3+ years of fighting, things have probably shifted. Ukrainians might not be as confident about winning against Russia, a country with 3 times their population. People are probably feeling more complicated about the whole thing, and some might be pretty down about how long this is dragging on. Plus, with Trump's stance on the war, Ukraine could very well end up having to give up some land to make the fighting stop. I mean, if the US is willing to sacrifice some of its own economic interests to force Canada to join up, could Canadians really hold out if their economy tanks and unemployment goes through the roof, like over 10%? So, considering all that, imagine you're the US president. No bloodshed, just a little give and take on the economic side, and you could swallow up a country bigger than your own during your time in office. Boom. America's twice the size, and you're a legend in the history books. Wouldn't that be tempting? And since Trump's a businessman at heart, what do you think he'd make of it? The above content does not carry any political bias, and I hope everyone can learn more about the United States and Canada, both past and present. If you liked the video, hit that like button and subscribe. Let's keep the conversation going in the comments below. See you next time.